How the Vikings survived without fireplaces. When we think of Viking life, we imagine roaring fires, glowing hearths, and halls filled with smoke and warmth. But the truth is far colder and far more ingenious. In the heart of the Viking world, there were no fireplaces, no chimneys, no central heating. Only endless winter, wood, stone, and human will. Yet somehow, entire families survived in homes where temperatures could fall below freezing. They didn't fight the cold, they learned to master it. This is the forgotten science of Viking survival, how they built, breathed, and thrived without firelight filling the sky. Chapter 1. The Heat of the Earth. The northern wind cuts the skin like blades of ice. The fjords are covered by a white crust. The sun barely rises over the horizon, and the long winters turn life into a matter of thermal calculation. For the Vikings, winter was not a season, it was an enemy, and defeating it required more than strength. It required understanding. 1,000 leagues to the west on the American plains, other hands were solving the same challenge. While the Mandan and Hidatsa dug their lodges beneath the frozen ground, the Vikings, without ever knowing them, were doing the same in Iceland, Norway, and Greenland. Both discovered that the Earth not only supports, it protects. 3 meters below the surface, the temperature remains close to 10 degrees Celsius, even when the outside air drops to -20. Modern physics calls it thermal mass. The ancestors called it shelter. In the remains found in Borg, Norway, archaeologists discovered traces of partially sunken houses with turf walls and roofs covered in sod. They were not simple huts, they were thermal systems. The ground retained the heat of the central fire, cold air filtered through side tunnels, and the circulation of smoke kept the interior dry. Viking architecture was alive, it breathed like an organism. The key was not the fire, it was the earth. In Greenland, excavations at Brattahlid, the farm of Eric the Red, revealed the same principle. Walls of stone and sod, roofs as thick as fortress walls, and a low corridor that served as natural insulation. Heat rose slowly from the ground, trapped by layers of moss and clay. Viking houses were designed as thermal traps. The smoke rose toward a minimal opening in the roof while fresh air entered below the level of the fire, creating a constant flow that fed the flame without letting the heat escape. The same principles used today in bioclimatic architecture were already written in the Nordic turf of the 9th century. There were no blueprints, no mathematics, only observation, trial, error, and memory. The Vikings knew that cold kills slowly, silently, and that a single misplaced stone could cost a life. That is why every shelter was a collective work. The elders chose the driest ground. The women wove insulation from wool and reed. The young men dug until they felt the air become still, that silence where heat begins to remain. Meanwhile, on the American plains, the natives used the same language without speaking it. Their pit houses and earth lodges breathed the same way. Fire in the center, smoke above, cool air below. The only difference was the landscape. The science was identical. In both worlds, the earth was mother and machine. In northern Iceland, archaeologists from the Skagafjörður Church and Settlement Project found, in 2023, tunnels connected to turf dwellings. When they measured the interior temperature, they discovered that even during Arctic storms, the ground maintained a constant 9.7 degrees. It was not a cultural coincidence. It was the convergence of human intelligence confronting the same enemy. Cold unites those who challenge it. Beneath the fjords, the Vikings dug small chambers beside their stables. There they stored butter, milk, and cured meat. The ground acted as a refrigerator in summer and as a heater in winter. The same system, reversed, governed by the simplest physics. The earth changes temperature thousands of times more slowly than air. The wisdom of the ancients was not intuition, it was empirical thermodynamics. They learned that survival did not mean fighting nature, but adapting to its rhythm. The earth taught them what no thunder god could. That strength without understanding is useless against winter. And so, in 2 distant continents, ancient peoples discovered the same principle that governs modern homes. Heat is not created, it is preserved. And beneath the frozen soil of Scandinavia, that truth became architecture. But how did the Vikings manage to maintain fire and breathable air inside an underground house without suffocating? The answer lies in the hidden design of their tunnels. Chapter 2. The System of Fire and Air. Inside a Viking shelter, the silence is dense. The light of the fire vibrates on the turf walls, tinting the surrounding faces with copper. The smoke rises slowly, curves, and disappears through an almost invisible opening in the roof. No one sneezes, no one coughs. The air is warm, yet breathable. How could a home like this function, without chimneys, without fans, without mistakes? The answer lies in the science of balance, the system of fire and air. Every Viking house known as a langhus was more than a dwelling. It was a thermal equation. Its heart was the central hearth, a shallow pit covered with volcanic stones that absorbed heat for hours. When the fire died down, the stones continued to radiate energy, keeping the interior temperature stable. The secret was not only in the fire, but in the way air fed it and evacuated it. Archaeologists at the Borg Museum, Lofoter Viking Museum, found in 2022 the marks of an underground channel running parallel to the main floor. It measured barely 30 centimeters high, but extended several meters from the exterior to the center of the hall. Dense, cold air slid through this tunnel, warmed as it passed near the fire, and rose, creating a continuous flow. Without knowing it, the Vikings had created a natural convection system, almost identical to the principles of modern passive ventilation. In Greenland, the side passages at Brattahlid served the same purpose. Their entrances were oriented south or southeast, where the winter wind blew with less force. The incoming current filtered along the ground, fed the flames, and escaped through a small upper opening where the smoke rose along with excess hot air. It was a closed cycle, self-regulated, efficient. No icy draft could rush in uncontrolled. But the most fascinating detail was not thermal, it was symbolic. For the Vikings, fire was the frontier between chaos and life. The Norse sagas say that the hearth must not die while the clan breathes, because extinguishing the flame was an invitation to death. This is why the design of their homes protected not only against cold, but for the spirit. Fire needed to breathe, just like people. Thousands of kilometers away, the peoples of the North American plateau, such as the Salish and Sahaptin, followed the same principle without knowing it. Their pit houses had an opening in the roof and an underground entrance tunnel with a small stone wall called a deflector. This wall diverted the cold air, guiding it toward the fire instead of striking those seated inside. The smoke rose slowly through the center, creating a warm layer that kept the temperature uniform. Modern engineers have replicated this design in thermal simulations, confirming that it retains 80% more heat than a surface cabin. The Vikings, at their end of the world, had reached the same conclusion. Air must move like a river, not like a blow of wind. Their passages, vaulted roofs, and ventilation pits were designed so that convection would do the work that electric motors do today. Where other peoples fought the climate, they redirected it. In recent excavations at Holar, Iceland, researchers from the Árni Magnússon Institute found fragments of charred wooden ducts aligned beneath the walls of a 10th century dwelling. Carbonization patterns showed that they were used to guide air from outside toward the central hearth without letting the flame consume the oxygen of the main room. In other words, a natural forced draft system, a millennium before modern controlled ventilation engineering. The parallels with America are inevitable. Both civilizations understood that survival depended not on dominating nature, but synchronizing with it. The Vikings observed how the fjord winds spiraled between rocks. Native peoples observed how cold air crawled over snow and sank into the ground. Both learned that heat and air are not opposites, they complement each other. Without flow, the fire dies. Without containment, heat escapes. Human ingenuity, separated by oceans, found the same language in the invisible physics of air. One civilization carved it in stone and turf, the other in clay and wood. Both, without knowing it, made the same pact with winter. We will resist you with your own laws. Today, architects who study sustainability call this principle bioclimatic design. The Vikings called it home, and when the wind howled outside, that home breathed with them, keeping alive the thin line between light and darkness. But even with fire and air in balance, a greater enemy remained: moisture. How did the Vikings prevent water and ice from destroying their underground shelters? The answer lies in the engineering of the soil. Chapter 3. The Invisible Enemy. Cold could kill you in hours, But moisture did it slowly, without sound, without warning. It was the invisible enemy. For the Vikings, it was not enough to build underground. They had to tame the water that seeped from the soil and the ice that formed above the roof. A single drop was the beginning of disaster. Moisture rotted the turf, swelled the wood, and turned heat into poisonous vapor. And yet, they survived for centuries. The secret was not only in the structure, but in understanding the land. Before raising a house, the Vikings observed how water moved during autumn rains. They marked the places where frost lasted the longest, the points where grass grew faster, and the soils where moss stayed dry. They had no compasses or topographic maps, but they possessed an almost geological wisdom, the reading of the ground. In Norway, archaeologists from the Tromsø Museum discovered that many 9th century semi-buried houses were built on a slight slope with an average inclination of 3 degrees toward the south. That small deviation was not accidental. It allowed meltwater to flow naturally outward. At the base of each wall, the Vikings placed alternating layers of stone and compressed clay, creating a primitive drainage system still visible today in excavations at Lafetur and Borg. It was pure engineering disguised as intuition. Native Americans faced the same enemy. Their pit houses, dug into the earth, could turn into mud pits during the thaw if not carefully planned. To prevent this, they built a ring of stones and gravel around the inner perimeter, a kind of absorbent trough that captured water and carried it away from the central hearth. Studies in the Columbia River Basin, in what are now Idaho and Washington, show that these systems kept dwellings dry even during heavy rainy seasons. 2 different worlds, the same struggle against moisture. In Iceland, where the soil is a mixture of volcanic ash and moss, the problem doubled. Filtered water not only cooled the house, it also released gases. The Vikings knew this. At the Stong excavation site, archaeologists found layers of pumice stone placed beneath the floors. This porous, lightweight stone acted as a breathable barrier that absorbed moisture without retaining it. It was a living floor, capable of drying itself when the fire went out. The system was not static, it was dynamic. Every winter the ground shifted, ice expanded, and water sought new paths. For this reason, the Vikings kept their houses under constant inspection. After each thaw, they removed damaged turf, reinforced joints with fresh clay, and added dry straw between layers, insulation that allowed the wall to breathe. The key was not to seal air or water, but to let both move without destroying the structure. In northern Norwegian villages, farmers still repeat an inherited proverb: a house that does not breathe dies. And they were right. Archaeologists from the Nordic Institute of Archaeology in Oslo confirmed that the oldest shelters, those sealed completely to keep out the cold, were the first to collapse. The ones that combined drainage, airflow, and flexible turf endured for centuries. In North America, tribes living in humid regions discovered the same principle. Mandan builders slightly elevated the central hearth with a base of hardened clay, preventing water from rising from the subsoil. The heat of the fire slowly dried the interior walls, while the upper layer of earth acted as a waterproof roof. The balance was so precise that the temperature remained constant day and night. What modern science calls high-growth thermal regulation was, for them, a form of respect. Both cultures understood that they could not dominate the soil, only coexist with its slow breath. Moisture was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to divert, a current that needed an exit. The Vikings took that understanding even further. In some Icelandic shelters, archaeologists found stone channels connected to side pits, likely used to drain meltwater or rain. They were simple systems, but so effective that 19th century Icelandic farmers still copied them unknowingly. Ancient wisdom survived disguised as habit. And so, stone by stone, the Nordic houses became self-sufficient organisms. Fire breathed, air circulated, moisture escaped, and heat remained. They were not primitive caves. They were ecosystems designed with a precision that today we would call sustainable. But for them, it was simply a matter of life or death. Winter could last 8 months, but underground, time seemed to stand still. The heat of the earth, the flow of air, and the pulse of water formed a perfect equation, a millenary synergy that united peoples who never met but understood the same truth. Nature is not conquered, it is negotiated. However, Viking shelters hid more than heat. Inside them there was hierarchy, spirituality, and power. Who slept beside the fire, and who kept it alive through the night? Chapter 4. The Heart of the Fire. Inside the shelter, night did not exist, only the breathing of the fire. Its light trembled across the turf walls, drawing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Outside, the wind roared over the fjords. Inside, time stood still. There, at the center of the Viking home, something more than heat burned. Identity burned. Fire was not an object. It was a frontier. It divided the world of the living from that of the dead, the chaos of the outdoors from the order of the clan. Everything revolved around it. Norse tales said that fire was born from the breath of the gods and must remain alive as long as the lineage breathed. For this reason, it was never allowed to die completely. Before sleeping, a woman of the clan stirred the embers with an iron rod, covering them with ash so they could continue breathing through the night. At dawn, a single blow of air was enough to revive the flame. The position of the hearth inside the house was not accidental. In the oldest langhus, the central fire was placed slightly toward the north, aligned with the entrance facing south. This layout allowed air to circulate naturally, but it also had symbolic meaning. The north was the realm of ice and darkness, the south, the direction of the sun. Fire united both worlds, becoming the invisible axis of the domestic universe. Life and hierarchy were arranged around it. The clan leader sat at the eastern end, the place of sunrise, symbol of authority and rebirth. Opposite him in the western area slept the young and the servants. Women occupied the central space near the fire because they were its guardians. The Icelandic chronicles mention the husfru, the lady of the house, as keeper of the hearth and protector of the heat. Her role was so sacred that no man could light the fire without her permission. In the silence of those endless nights, the shelter became a temple. The flames lit tanned hides, hanging tools, tired faces. The walls breathed with them, the smoke filtered like incense, and every crackle of the fire was a prayer. Children listened to stories, how Odin brought knowledge, how the northern ice broke to release life, how the first fire was born from thunder. They were not just myths, they were survival manuals disguised as legend. Across the ocean, native peoples did the same. In their earth lodges, families gathered around the central fire. Elders told the story of the Sipapu, the sacred hole in the floor that represented the portal from which the first humans emerged from the underworld. Each home was symbolically a replica of the cosmos. Fire as the sun, smoke as breath, earth as mother. The Vikings never heard those stories, but they lived their own versions. Both cultures understood that physical survival and spiritual survival were inseparable. Archaeological studies from Borg and Brattahlid have revealed remains of burned offerings near the main hearths. Fragments of bones, seeds, even small pieces of amber. Researchers believe they were tributes to the spirit of fire, a way to thank it for protection. Fire gave warmth, but also justice. Oaths were sworn before it, agreements sealed, counsel sought. Its smoke rose like a messenger toward the gods. The Viking shelter was more than architecture. It was a microcosm. Every stone, every post, every crack served a visible and an invisible purpose. Heat was not just thermal energy. It was a symbol of cohesion, lineage, permanence. This is why, when a clan abandoned its home, they did not extinguish the fire. They buried it. They covered it with ash and turf, sealing the past with the same respect used for a grave. Modern archaeology has confirmed what the sagas barely hinted at. Many abandoned shelters preserve at their center a block of blackened stone, still bearing traces of animal fat and charcoal. These hearths are the petrified hearts of ancient winters. In their silence remains the breath of generations. In America, the same gesture repeated itself. When a native family left its winter house, they closed the roof opening with a stone and placed inside a piece of still warm charcoal. It was a farewell and a promise. They would return when the cold returned. Thus, in two distant worlds, humanity sealed the same pact with earth and fire. Both understood that heat is not only generated, it is cared for. To keep a flame alive was to keep a people alive. And when everything around froze, the only boundary between death and life was a glowing ember breathing beneath the earth. But how did the Vikings spread this knowledge across the entire North, without blueprints, without writing, without error? The next chapter reveals how their engineering was transmitted through memory and ritual. Chapter 5. The Memory of the Soil. Nothing is forgotten underground, not the heat, not the footsteps, not the dreams of those who dug to survive. The earth holds memory, and that memory was the greatest legacy of the ancients. The Vikings knew this. That is why they built with turf, with stone, with materials time could not easily destroy. Every layer of their house was a line of their history. At the excavation site of Lanceau Meadows on the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, archaeologists found the remains of an 11th century Norse settlement. Beneath the grass, the marks in the soil told a story that seemed impossible. The same drainage patterns, the same interwoven turf walls, the same ventilation tunnels as in Borg or Brattahlid. Thousands of kilometers from Scandinavia, the Vikings had replicated their thermal knowledge with astonishing precision. They carried no blueprints, no instruments, no written treatises. They carried the memory of the soil. That knowledge was not transmitted through words. It passed from hands to hands, from glances to glances, as children watched their parents build shelters with the same gestures their grandparents had used. Every stone had a meaning. Every orientation had a reason. They knew that the sun rose low in winter, and its light had to enter from the east. They knew the northern wind had to be blocked with natural mounds, and that the fire breathed best when the entrance tunnel pointed south. These were unwritten laws, engraved in practice, just like the native tribes who built their houses under the same principles, thousands of kilometers away. Modern anthropologists describe this phenomenon as empirical transfer of thermal technology. But at its core, it was something deeper. It was not applied science. It was a philosophy of continuity. Knowledge did not belong to an individual, but to the lineage. For this reason, when a home collapsed or was abandoned, it became a school. Young people unearthed the foundations to study how the soil had formed, which layers stayed dry, which layers had sunk. They learned from error, and error became heritage. In the Norwegian fjords, archaeology has revealed that some farms were rebuilt in the same location for more than 200 years. The oldest foundations served as the base for new shelters, benefiting from already stabilized soil. Each generation reinforced, adapted, perfected. The earth was a living archive, a library that preserved the secrets of heat. Likewise, on the American plains, native villages were rebuilt over the remains of earlier earth lodges. The already dug ground retained shape, texture, even natural drainage. Rebuilding was easier where the memory of warmth still pulsed. Archaeologists in the Missouri Valley found thermal signatures in sediments, areas where the soil was still warmer due to centuries of accumulated fire. Heat had literally modified the geology. The soil remembered. The Vikings not only understood that memory, they revered it. The sagas mention that a warrior should not die far from the land of his home because the soil warmed by his fire would recognize him in death. It was a poetic way of saying that we live where we learn to preserve heat. And although words fade, gestures remain. In Iceland, today's turf house builders still follow techniques nearly identical to those of the Middle Ages. Blocks are cut in the same direction, stacked at the same angle, and left to dry at the same rhythm. Not out of superstition, because they know that is how the wall breathes properly. This continuity of more than 1,000 years proves that the memory of the soil is not taught, it is repeated. Modern thermal archaeology, using sensors and infrared cameras, has confirmed that Viking houses retained 40% more energy efficiency than contemporary wooden structures in southern Europe. But the number is not what astonishes. What astonishes is that such knowledge was preserved without writing, without diagrams, without formal science, only through experience and patient observation of the natural world. And as centuries passed, that memory crossed oceans. When the first European colonists arrived in North America, many adopted building techniques inspired by the native peoples already living there. Rammed earth walls, sod roofs, south-facing entrances. Unknowingly, they were recovering the same principles their Norse ancestors had discovered centuries earlier. History, like the temperature of the soil, stabilized once again. Today, science confirms what both peoples already knew. 1 meter underground, the Earth's temperature stays constant, between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius. This principle, known as thermal mass, is the foundation of sustainable climate control systems in the 21st century. The ancients had no sensors or thermometers, only their skin, their patience, and their memory. The most enduring knowledge is not written in stone or parchment. It is written in the earth. Every layer, every imprint, every collapsed turf wall in Iceland or Dakota tells the same story. Humanity survived not by building higher walls, but by digging toward the heat that had always been there beneath their feet. But the most surprising thing is not what the Vikings built, but what they left underground. We discover it in the final chapter. Winter ends, but the earth remains warm. The turf shelters melt under the sunlight, and the smoke of the last embers rises into a clear sky. Where there was darkness, there is now calm. The Vikings step into the cold spring air just as the native peoples emerge through the roof hole of their earth lodges. Both return to the surface with the same certainty. Heat is not created, it is preserved. For centuries, we believed technology was the heritage of iron, steam, and steel, but the true engineers were those who learned to read the ground. Beneath their feet, they discovered a truth that modern science would take 1,000 years to rediscover. The planet has its own thermal pulse. Summer heat sinks into the earth, accumulates, and returns in winter, like a deep breath. The ancients did not measure it. They felt it. Archaeologists at Borg, Brattahlid, and Lanso Meadows have shown that those semi-buried structures were not improvised shelters. They were climate laboratories. Their design balanced temperature, moisture, and airflow with a precision comparable to modern climate control systems. And all without a single advanced metal tool, only wood, stone, turf, and knowledge. Fire was their energy, but the earth was their ally. And the pact between both elements allowed life to continue where no human should have survived. The Vikings, the native peoples, the northern and southern cultures, all discovered the same truth without speaking the same language. Nature is not defeated, it is understood. Today, architects studying sustainability look to the past to learn about the future. The principles of passive construction, natural ventilation, and thermal mass are the same ones used by the ancestors 1,000 years ago. None of it was magic. It was observation, adaptation, and respect. Knowledge born from necessity, not ambition. The earth that once protected them now preserves them. In every excavation, in every collapsed turf wall, in every stone blackened by fire, history still breathes. And if you crouch down and touch that soil, you can still feel a faint warmth, the echo of all the nights in which humans and nature shared a roof. The Vikings did not conquer winter. They understood it, and by doing so, they left beneath our feet a lesson written in silence. Everything that survives does so because it remembers how to preserve heat. If you want to discover more about how the Vikings transformed the earth into their greatest ally and survived where no one else could, subscribe and join us on the next journey into the heart of the past.